We have today the pleasure of hosting Dr. Pronab Sen, former Chief Statistician of India. Dr. Sen, who has decades of experience in academia and public policy making, shares his views on how the government may approach the upcoming union budget and how India can return on a path of sustainable economic growth after the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome to the show, sir, and thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome, Bhaskar.
The government is drafting the budget for the next financial year at a time when a fresh COVID wave has struck the country. In your view, where do we stand as far as the sustainability of the recovery is concerned?
The recovery, as we have seen so far, is sustainable up to a point, but there is a limit to it, which I will come back to if you desire. The real issue is this the nature of recovery that we really want? That really is the question, because I think now there is pretty much consensus among economists at least that the recovery has been very uneven, not necessarily sector-wise, but in terms of different income categories. So the nature of the recovery is that corporate India has recovered and recovered very handsomely, but non-corporate India, which includes the unorganized sector and the MSMEs, are still hurting quite badly. And that is a growth trajectory which can be sustained for maybe a couple of years. But what happens is that since the bulk of employment and income generation in the country is driven, in fact, by the non-corporate sector, this kind of growth will tend to start going towards stagnation a couple of years down the road, because the consumption base would not be growing. So for India to have a sustainable 7% plus growth rate, which is what we should aspire to do, and we are capable of doing it, we have to make sure that the corporate and non-corporate India grow more or less in tandem. That is the sustainable growth path. Any deviation from that can lead to one type of problem or another.
Data on the ground show that capacity utilization in the manufacturing sector continues to face headwinds. The government has been making efforts to provide a boost through the PLI schemes, but consumer demand still remains weak. What are the possible steps that the government could announce in the budget to address the issue?
Well, this is the thing. Things like the PLI will work if and only if the manufacturers see a credible external market, that is an export market. Otherwise, the PLI won't work unless domestic consumption is growing strongly. And as you very rightly said, domestic consumption is doing anything but that. It's in fact very weak. And the reason for that is, as I said, that if the MSMEs are not picking up, you're not getting the process of income being generated in the lower middle class in particular, which is really the aspirational class in India, which drives consumption very strongly. So the focus needs to be in that area.
Where does the government stand as far as its finances are concerned? Conservative budget assumptions and strong revenue streams may ensure that the fiscal deficit target for the current year is met. But how much fiscal ammunition does the centre have going ahead? Which are the areas the government should target to kickstart a virtuous investment cycle?
The government does have headroom. The question, of course, is, will a large fiscal stimulus really help? That really, I think, is the question that we need to ask ourselves. And the answer is that yes, up to a point it will. But the nature of the problem that we are facing now is that the last budget didn't do what I think should have been done, which was done, by the way, in the previous year, when the pandemic first struck us. The government made a lot of effort to keep the MSMEs alive. There are a lot of initiatives that were taken, beginning with the moratorium on repayment of bank loans and so on. And then you had special provisions being made for startup loans, to additional startup loans to the MSME sector. Unfortunately, none of these initiatives, which were taken in 1920, were continued in 2021 when the second wave struck. In fact, all of these went off. And the net result, of course, is my suspicion is that despite the fact that the lockdown was much more drastic in 1920, 2021, I think we have seen more damage in the MSMEs. There's been, I think, much greater number of closures. Now, restarting a business is a very different proposition from keeping a business alive. Okay? Exactly. Keeping a business alive, the government can do. But restarting businesses is a much trickier proposition, because all the government can really do is, number one, it can provide the demand impetus, which is where I said the fiscal, the expenditure side becomes important. The second is what it can do is to backstop the financial sector in terms of loan guarantees of various kinds. Now, loan guarantees don't really involve upfront expenditure by the government. But what they do is that they provide the finances for MSMEs which have shut shop to reopen on the strength of fresh borrowings. So if that is the
very likely
government desires to take, then the budgetary provisions in this particular year don't have to be very large at all. A certain amount of support will have to be given to the demand side, and that is particularly clear now with inflation being an impending problem. It's a bit of a problem now, and it's likely to get worse. So in this situation, I think it becomes necessary for the government to shift the responsibility for inflation management back to monetary policy, which means back to the Reserve Bank, and use fiscal policy for the demand side, for the growth story. Now, if that happens, a certain degree of fiscal expansion would be warranted. But if they're going the guarantee path, that may be relatively smaller than one would have thought otherwise.
Speaking of inflation, the RBI has consistently reiterated the need for a degree of prolonged policy support to revive growth, even as inflation has been running higher than the medium-term target for some time now. Do we face the risk of inflation expectations getting entrenched and thus further hitting consumer demand?
Well, you see, it's a not simply a question about inflationary expectations getting entrenched. There's something else which has happened, which makes the inflation danger a little worse than it would have been otherwise. And that is that corporate India's market share has gone up, which means that their pricing power has increased. And as a result, what we are seeing, and this seems to be across the board, that despite the fairly low capacity utilization, which is capacity utilization of sub 70%, right? There's been a fair amount of price rise in corporate India products, and that's because pricing power has shifted. And this is not going to go away in a hurry. Until the MSMEs have come back in full strength, this pricing power will stay with the corporates, and they will actually use it.
Does India have a growing problem with the size of public debt? By all accounts, the government's borrowing for the next financial year is again likely to be near record highs. Could this burgeoning debt to GDP ratio have the effect of crowding out investment?
No, frankly, our debt GDP ratio is not at an alarming level. In fact, getting fixated on the debt GDP ratio without really looking at where the economy is in terms of its overall health is silly, frankly, and it should not be done. So in the kind of situation that we've had for the past 2 years with repeated shocks from COVID, an increase in the debt to GDP ratio is not merely expected, it is in fact desirable. The time for correction will come once the economy has recovered. we are still only around 90%. I mean, that's other countries have gone way above. So I don't think we should worry too much about it. We should focus much more on A, trying to get back to the 7% plus growth path, and B, trying to keep inflation down.
Lastly, what we would like to ask is that if you were in the finance ministry at this point of time, what would your prescriptions be for returning on a sustainable path of economic growth?
I would say that my focus, I won't say a prescription, because the prescriptions are very situation specific, and that is something that the finance ministry and hopefully Niti Aayog together should be able to sort out. But the basic objective should be to recognize the fact that the MSME sector is badly damaged, and the kind of steps that are needed, not for encouraging them, but for encouraging them to restart their businesses. That, I think, is at the heart of the recovery story. And if we don't do it now, it may become a little late.
Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Sen.